Going to do chapter 31, and we're actually going to go into Second Samuel chapter 1 because they kind of talk about the same thing. Obviously, my little girl's not here today. She's kind of hanging out with Grandma today, having a good time with her. So she's hanging out there, and I'd like to show Noah sometime again, but Noah's actually taking a nap right now. So it is just me. So if you get on here mainly to see those one of those two, I fully understand. Excuse me. Um, but they're not here. So we're going to wrap up today in First Samuel, and also just to let you guys know, this will be the last one of these we do for about a month. I want to take a bit of a break, take a rest. We've been doing this for a long time now, but when we come back, we're going to go just straight into Second Samuel. But we're actually going to cover the first chapter of Second Samuel today, and also the last chapter of First Samuel. And the reason we're going to do that is because we're going to merge David and Saul's story again. So if you remember the last couple of weeks, we did a couple chapters of David, and we skipped around to sort of tell the storyline of what David is doing. Then we turned last week and we talked about what Saul is doing. And here, kind of now at this very critical point in the story, we're going to merge them and we're going to talk about them together. So um, like I said, chapter 31 is very short. Chapter one's a little longer because it's also got a poem or a song or something a lament, and so we're going to cover both of those chapters and talk about those today. So, starting at the beginning of verse 31. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled. And the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard that what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. After the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from battle," he replied. "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on a spear with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me and said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I am still alive.' So I stood behind him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and brought them here to my lord." Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" He says, "I am the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift the hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Go strike him down." So he struck him down and died. For David said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" David took up the lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered the people of Judah to be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar. A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel, how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, let the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, may no showers fall on your terraced fields, for there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, from the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for your Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother, for you were dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished. And so we end today, and it feels like we're going to talk through a tragedy, and in some ways I think it is, and I'll kind of explain why, even though I think Saul's been in some ways kind of villainized in this book. Um, Starting back in chapter 31, we have this battle, and it doesn't go well, and we see the Philistines overtake them. We hear quickly of Saul's three sons, including Jonathan, who would be the crown prince for Saul, all die in battle. Um, we then hear that Saul is mortally wounded by the archers. Which, if you're now in range of archer in warfare at this time, you were done. That was sort of the end of it for you. And we see that he's mortally wounded, and he asks his armor bearer to kill him. His armor bearer doesn't want to, and then he lies on his own sword. And we find out actually a little bit later a little bit more of the story, but we'll leave that for later. Um, but then he takes his own life, and then we see the armor bearer himself um, actually take his own life. And I want to stop there just for historical points. And there's going to be various points here where I want to talk historical, just some of the historical context of what we're doing. The armor bearer killing himself after Saul killed himself is actually pretty common in warfare in this age. That person was sworn to the person, and in some ways, the oath they took was that if the king to which you are sworn to dies, you die as well. Your life is that tied to them, and that's likely why the armor bearer at that point took his own life. And then we hear about them finding Saul's body the next day, taking it, removing his head, and putting the body up onto the wall um, of one of the towns in Philistine. And then we hear of a very brave group of people who actually go sneak out during the night, take his body, and give it a proper burial. And so then getting to it, because I do want to get to chapter 1 of 2 Samuel pretty quickly, we actually get more detail of the death of Saul. And I think it's important to hear it. We hear of an Amalekite that comes to David to tell of the death of Saul. And he notes that Saul did indeed tried to take his own life. He tried to kill himself and fall on his own sword, and he was able to get it in, but not finish the job. And Saul asks this Amalekite to finish him off, and he does. And we see David take this, and in some ways, I think the Amalekite thought he was doing the right thing because he was considering that Saul was not going to make it. He was going to fully die no matter what, and he felt like he was probably doing this out of compassion, and he likely was. When David hears of it, all of his people tear their clothes and they weep and they mourn, and they kill the Amalekite because he laid a hand on the Lord's anointed. And so we still see here, and we've seen throughout this entire book, the reverence and respect and honor that David gives to Saul because he is the Lord's anointed. Now remember, David's actually also the Lord's anointed. He was anointed early on in here, but he takes Saul's as sort of the upper precedent and doesn't want to lay a hand on him. And then we hear about this. We hear about this poetry or this lament that David gives, really talking about Saul and weeping and mourning about Saul. And we just see, like I said, this whole thing is sad and it's tragic. And what I think is really interesting and something that maybe even in my own fault, talking about this and in the way I think in our culture we think of Saul, we think of him a lot of times as some sort of villain in some ways because he's chasing David for so much of it, and he has kind of this mind to kill David, and we know that David eventually is going to become a good king. Um, but what we see here in these two chapters, if you think about what you're seeing and hearing, is we're actually hearing about a man who's very beloved, and also a person that appears to be a pretty good king. And in fact, at one point in the in here in 2 Samuel verse chapter 1 verse 24, we actually hear him say, "Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments and ornaments of gold." It was likely that it appears, just with the way the poems are, it does appear that Israel prospered under Saul. It appears that, and generally speaking, if you take what you hear in chapter 30, in chapter 30, and if you take what you hear in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, you hear of a good king. You hear of a guy that seems to have done a really good job. Um, but I think in our modern day, we've really kind of we see him as the enemy of David, as a man who greedily and jealously took up David, and we think really we focus really on that part, and we think about his failings to Samuel and not killing the Amalekites when he told him to, which is what caused his downfall. Um, we hear of all these things, but we also now hear of a person that seems who have been very beloved, revered by his kingdom. So it doesn't seem like he was a tyrant. It doesn't seem like he was terrible. He seems like he was a person that had a lot of great qualities and had one or two really bad fatal flaws. And for him, truly fatal, led to the downfall of him, and will lead to the downfall of his house. And so I think it's something to remember here. I think a lot of times when we watch movies, when we read books, there's a lot of times where um, we see a person as either a hero or a villain, and we don't respect that humans are very complicated, and that they can in fact be both, and they can be both at the same time. We can be both good and bad at the same times, and be doing it in different aspects of our lives. Think of it this way from a perspective of sin. I may do well with several commandments, several laws, several of the things that God tells us to do, and then I might be really bad at one or two of them, to the point where they would be considered fatal flaws if it wasn't for the grace of Jesus. And I think we're all like that. And so when we talk with each other, when we converse with each other, I think we need to remember that all of us as humans are complex, and as a result, we need to respect the complexity. And what we need to do is encourage and promote those good things, and help people through and understand, and help people understand the struggle they have with fatal flaws, and help work through that with them instead of bashing them. And don't allow a fatal flaw of someone. Don't see something that you see as the bad thing. Don't let that action define them as a bad person. I think a lot of times we do that as well. We take a set of actions and that are bad or wrong, and and we uh, and we make them into a bad person. We make them into evil because of some of the bad actions, when really it was an action that was bad, where the person could still be good, and doing their best, and just struggling with something. We need to be very understanding of people for that reason. And we see Saul here. We see a complex man who apparently, to David and his men, and to who have been being pursued by Saul this entire time. We see them weep in terror and mourn. And we see a poem that talks about Saul as a good king and Jonathan as a good friend. And this doesn't sound like the Saul that we've heard for the last 15 chapters of this book. Because the last 15 chapters, he's been all we hear about is his jealousy of David and trying to kill David. And we don't hear about all the other stuff happening in the kingdom that might have been innately good. And so I think we probably do a little bit of disservice to Saul. Um, he definitely had fatal flaws. He definitely pursued David. It was definitely wrong of him to do that. And he was definitely removed from being king of Israel because he did not follow God's order to kill all the Amalekites. Um, But we shouldn't make it that those two wrongs by themselves made him universally bad, which I think sometimes we do. We do in this story, we do in the book of Samuel, and we do in other parts of our lives. So I think we need to be cautious of that. One more thing here, but as we look at this, is there is a sense of irony, and in some ways, I want to go through it for just a minute. There is something interesting about the fact that an Amalekite is the one who kills Saul, given that it was the Amalekites who Saul was ordered to completely wipe out. If you remember, this is why he lost the kingdoms, because God said, wipe all the Amalekites. Don't leave a one of them. Don't leave anybody. Don't keep their slaves. You kill everyone, including the livestock. Leave nothing. This is, he will, God in the order wants them completely wiped out. And I do wonder here if part of the reason why that God gave that order is because he sees here in this future. And let's talk about if Saul would have wiped out the Amalekites, David, even if David would have became a great general at the time because of his ability, he might have stayed with Saul because Saul would have been as jealous, knowing that he had disobeyed. We know that David has to pursue the Amalekites as we see in chapter 31 or in chapter 30 here. Let me make sure. I keep saying 30 and 31, but let me make sure I'm in 31. I'm sorry. And actually in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, we hear about David wiping out the rest of the Amalekites after the Amalekites had actually grabbed most of the people that were with David. Um, and then he gets to he hears about Saul. We hear of Saul dying from an Amalekite. If he had wiped out the Amalekites, he might not have had jealousy. He might not have drove off David. And even if he had drove off David for some reason, the Amalekites would have actually not been in a position to raid and kidnap all of David's people. And as a result, David might have turned back to Israel and gotten to Saul for this battle before it was too late, and he might have been able to save Saul. Likewise, and we don't know because God works in such mysterious ways at times. If that Amalekite wasn't there to kill Saul, maybe something happens where people rally around the king, and he somehow survives, and they actually kind of bring from the depths of defeat, this victory against the Philistines. That wouldn't be all that shocking. Um, and so there's a lot of times where when God gives us an order, um, it's not an order because God needs it. God can do whatever He wants to do. He doesn't need us to do anything for Him. But a lot of times the commands that He gives us are for our own benefit to grow us in some way. And I wonder if maybe this is one of those cases where that order from this order that Saul didn't obey, maybe this is why, because he knew it would lead to his downfall eventually, whether God turned away from him or not. I think there's something in there that to be thought about when we talk about when we disobey God or we don't listen to God or don't follow through with God. When He gives us a command, it's for a reason, and we should obey it. And so, as we finish off, the thing is remember with these people, we do have fatal flaws. All of us do. We're all sinners, and so by default we have fatal flaws. And we just need to remember that if it wasn't for Jesus, we would all have those, and those would be truly fatal for us. But He saves us all. He's the one that had no fatal flaws, and took it up for us, took it up on the cross for us. We should remember that, and we should show that sort of compassion to everybody out there. God looked past Jesus, and God looked past our fatal flaws to save us, and so we need to do the same with other people and help them, and make people help each other to grow. One interesting thing, and when we get to Second Samuel, because I've already started kind of looking at the chapters and getting it ready, something I think that's interesting. I'll just give this teaser for as we get ready to go into Second Samuel. There's one very interesting. Um, there's one very interesting spot in verse 17 of chapter 1 here, that I think I want everyone to note here. Right before they do the lament for Saul, David took up a lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. it's notice here that David's ordering the people of Judah to be taught this. Now, maybe this is a timing thing, and later on, this is when David's king of Judah. We don't know that for certain, but I do find it interesting. Let's say that he's not yet king of Judah. I think it's interesting that a couple chapters ago we saw him sending gifts to the leaders of Judah, and now he's ordering the people of Judah to be taught a lament of Saul. What it's showing, and some of the foreshadowing here, is that David's now sort of David is now turning into more of a leadership role beyond the 400 to 600 people that were with him. He's now sort of giving orders to one of the tribes of Israel, not all of Israel, but to a tribe of Israel. And I think that's very important as we go into into Second Samuel and work through that. Um, and so that's it for us. This is kind of our this is us for a little bit of a break. I did hope you enjoyed that discussion. Like I said, I think we should remember Saul with sadness, and I think a lot of times I think we look at him going, well, he got what he deserved for the jealousy and stuff, and I think we need to remember him with some compassion and sadness for the tragedy that kind of fell him, and we should remember that none of us are really any better than what Saul was. We all have those fatal flaws that if we allow them will take us down, and so we just need to be conscious of it and work our best to work towards improving ourselves. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for letting us be able to do this here online and to talk about your word and learn. Thank you for letting me do this for the last year or so. It's helped me a lot. Help us to be compassionate towards each other. Help us to understand that everyone's got an issue that, whether they know it or not, could lead to them to having some real struggles. Help us to help each other, to identify them, and to, in loving ways, grow each other so that we don't end up in the same spot as Saul. And thank you so much for your son's death that really saved us from all of our fatal flaws. Because in the end, we already had things that made it fatal for us, and he wiped them clean for us. And help us to remember him and honor him for what he did for that. And we ask for these things in Jesus' name. Amen. But thank you guys. I appreciate everyone for the last year and a half doing this. And like I said, we're only going to be gone for a month. So, like I said, but I just want to say thank you all for watching with me. I want to do a special thanks to first to Pastor Earl, who let me start this, and then to Pastor Scott, who let me continue it. Just so everyone knows, I write these up, but no one proofs them. So, Pastor Scott, Pastor Earl, they don't see any notes or any script that I write before I get on here. And frankly, even if they did, there's a lot of times where there's things that as I talk on here, if you can tell that I kind of could just come up on as we're discussing it. It's a very loose set of notes. And so that's a lot of trust to put into somebody with the people of their church. And so I really appreciate that trust. There's not a lot of people, I think, in this world that would actually give that much trust to a person. And so I do really appreciate that trust. And I hope I've been able to earn that trust, to keep that trust, and not stray in a way that was where you wouldn't want me to be. So have a great first of the summer. We will see you kind of midsummer here. Like I said, we'll see you probably at the end of June, starting of July. Be safe as you go out and start to get into the warmer weather, and hope you have a great time, and we'll see you again soon. So have a great evening, guys. Have a great week, and we'll see you here